Este é o podcast TozziniFreire.
Hello, everyone. Hi, Gerry. This is so wonderful to see you. It's too bad that we are only going to do the podcast today, not video. But it's very exciting to have you here, as I mentioned in our invitation to you. This is a very important initiative that TozziniFreire organized in view of our 10th anniversary of Brazilian anti-corruption legislation, but which is also known as the Clean Company Act. This is a part of our journey, right, in this big work to boost understanding about compliance. And it was 2006 when we first went to the Annual Institute of Society of Corporate Compliance and Ethics, where we met many of your colleagues, and you are not yet CEO of the organization, but I'm sure you're already pretty much involved in the organization. So this is part of our journey, it is part of history, and also for many professionals in Brazil, they also understand SCCE being part of their professional history as well. So thank you again for being with us in our first podcast, which is in celebration of this this event that we are going to be holding in July 31st and August 1st. So Gerry, let's just start asking you about how is doing SCCE and SCCA, so you can tell us a little bit about the organization.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. This is a wonderful occasion on the 10th anniversary of the legislation, and Brazil has made so much progress over the years, and it's a real pleasure to be able to be part of it. As you said, I wish I could be there in person, but I guess this is the next best thing. With a couple, I have a couple of scheduling conflicts that really were pre-existing over that July 31st, August 1st timeframe. But yeah, as you mentioned, it's funny that you mentioned 2006, because that is right around the time that I got involved with SCCE. I think I went to an academy right around that time, either 2006 or 2007, that I went to an academy and got certified, got my CCEP. Interestingly, the academy that I went to was, I think, their first, SCCE's first that they did outside of the United States. I actually went to Toronto. And that may have been the first one that they did outside the United States. The first one in Brazil was in 2010, as I recall. But for those that aren't familiar, the Society of Corporate Compliance and Ethics and Healthcare Compliance Association, in addition to having such a very, very long name, is a global organization founded in 1996. So we are past our 25th anniversary. We've got somewhere between 19,000 and 20,000 members globally in about 100 countries. The U.S. is, of course, the largest concentration of members, but Brazil is actually the second largest in terms of membership for the organization. The reason, for those of you that are kind of curious, the reason for this long name is that for this first about 5 to 7 years, the organization's sole focus was healthcare compliance, so it's known as the Healthcare Compliance Association. And then in the early 2000s, somewhere around 2003, 2004, is when the organization really then opened itself up to the broader compliance community globally with all industries. So thus we've operated sort of as one company with two divisions for many, many years. So Society of Corporate Compliance and Ethics, one side of the organization, and Healthcare Compliance Association as the other. Between the two of them, we do more than 100 conferences a year. That includes virtual, of course, virtual or in-person conferences, and then dozens of other short webinars as well. But about 100, I think about 45 of which are SCCE focused. Wow. Several are done internationally, in person, outside the United States. And some of the virtual events we time for time zones outside of the United States. We recently were doing one for our investigations course done on Singapore time. So we time our events to coincide with various regions around the world. So it's a wonderful, I've been with the organization since 2017. I was brought on to kind of succeed Roy Snell, one of the co-founders and longtime CEO of the organization. So it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, Roy Snell was the CEO at the time when the board approved to hold the first base academy in compliance and ethics in Brazil. As you just mentioned about 2010, it is more than 14 years. But more than that, I think that why this law is meaningful to the professional compliance, that the law brought this provision establishing that because since this was a first legislation that bring a quite heavy penalty for corporation getting into trouble, including corruption cases, for instance, it brought this incentive for corporations to build their integrity program, or also known as a compliance program, would be able to have a benefit of some reduction of the penalty. So that was I would say, the engine behind why people start boosting, trying to understand what this compliance is about. So although we have held our first academy in 2010, by the time when the law was getting into force, really brought much more attention to compliance field. I mean, this was amazing. So in that end, I was wondering about, you mentioned that Brazil is already the second largest, members in terms of the size. And I was wondering about, how the number is, and also a little bit about certification, your experience in Brazil. I think that it'd be good to hear. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, it's. I wish I had the updated membership numbers handy. I did look up the certification numbers in preparation for this. I think the membership numbers are in the upper hundreds for Brazil. I think it's in that 600 or so members. Wow. I recall, but I hesitate giving a number because, like I said, I didn't look that number up. I do know that from a certification standpoint, there is just over 200 people in Brazil who have attained our certification. Most of them are the CCEPI, and then there are a handful that have the CCEP. Sometimes I think the CCEPs in Brazil are probably mostly, Brazil-based folks of U.S. companies, perhaps. So they elected to get the CCEP, which has a little bit more of the U.S. Legal issues in it. Whereas the CCEPI, the international version, goes more just broader issues. But yeah, I researched it just yesterday. We got 205 people in Brazil who currently are holding our certification. So it's really just been tremendous with the support that we've seen in Brazil. There's no doubt in my mind why the faculty of the academy really enjoys coming to Brazil every year. And it's such an enthusiastic group and a very committed group. I'm not sure if it began this way in 2013 and then 14 with the enactment of the law itself, or if there was already a lot of momentum growing. I get the sense, even though I wasn't there in the early 2010s, but I get the sense that there was clearly some momentum growing significantly in Brazil for compliance that led to the passage of the law. All I know is that since I've been involved, and I've made 2 or 3 trips to Brazil now for the academies, every year either I go or our chief engagement and strategy officer, Adam Turtletop, will go to the academy in Brazil. It's just such a wonderful event, and we just love, chatting with the audience there, which is so committed, so supportive. I think one of the other things that I've noticed in Brazil is the degree to which the compliance profession supports one another. It really is a dedicated community. It's more of a community than a profession. It is a profession, but there's truly a community in Brazil. We can see that the people helping each other, and we see that in other parts of the world as well. But I think the degree to which we see it in Brazil is unmatched. The compliance community in Brazil is really just something to behold. It's just wonderful to see.
It is, you're right. I think there's a community of compliance professionals in Brazil. And as you said, obviously, I think that the law brought, the push that was needed for the corporations and companies to put aside an investment that would be, allocated to the compliance initiative. But more than that, for the professionals already, there was this common sense that, something has to be changed, that many professionals want to be part of it, right? The beauty of compliance that is not only for lawyers, but accountants. There are many different professionals that come together and believe that they are doing something to change overall, the environment, or business environment. So I think that was where the Brazilian community has this huge standing. So, it is interesting that you're noticing that. And Gerry, so I was just, you were just mentioning about Adam, but you know that Adam loves Brazilian food. So this is why he keeps saying, I have to go back to Brazil. I love the food, In addition to the friends that he makes. He's like, I love Brazilian food.
We've got a standing running joke between Adam and I, and it says, it's the first few words of my sentence is, will you go to Brazil? He said, the answer will always be yes.
Yes, I'll go to That's nice. And, the part of one of the chapters that we're going to do is we're going to talk about the certification of Debbie and Cheryl. This will be planned because there are so many professionals. They love faculty of the academy, so they want to also hear from them. So that'd be great. So you also mentioned about this expansion of SCCE and SCCA, and not only in Brazil, but you also mentioned so many other countries. So I was wondering, from your experience, why is that? Why there are so many, need for compliance in so many different countries? Do you see any difference from, obviously, I guess there are some cultural differences, but the bottom line is that, everybody's trying to seek some development, right? Professional development in some new fields. So I was wondering about, your opinion on that.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's a very good question, because I think a lot of it stems from the fact that there continues to be evidence that having a compliance program does indeed help. And I mean, let's face it, one of the biggest, incentives for having an effective compliance program in place is something you already touched on, which is a potential reduction in penalties, avoidance of penalties, minimization of investigative costs, things of that nature. I know one of the very last investigations I worked on before taking this position, so back in, I guess, 2016, was just a perfect case study in that. By the investigation I was working on is more of a financial reporting fraud case, but nonetheless, the exact same principles applied. So even though it wasn't corruption, it was a similar kind of a case in many regards. And the enforcement agencies, in addition to giving recognition to the fact that the company had good internal controls in place, and part of that, of course, was the compliance program. They felt so good about the program and the nature, the manner in which we self-disclosed and all of this, that they actually allowed us to do the vast majority of the investigation and simply turn the results over to them. For them to, obviously, they still needed to get comfortable with everything and do their own level of work. But that, to me, it was such a huge selling point for having a good program in place. I mean, it was in action rather than having a bunch of government investigators just pouring through everything in the office. It was more of letting us as outside counsel and outside advisors do the investigation, package it all up, send it off to the regulators or to the enforcement community, And they still did some of their own investigative work, but it was not nearly as painful, as it otherwise could have been. So I think you see this trend globally in terms of this growth of compliance programs. And one of the things that's sort of fun about it is you see little differences popping up in terms of how compliance works from one region of the world to another, recognizing that, what might be a great set of rules in the United States, might not work quite as well in another part of the world. So they borrow some of the same principles or utilize some of the same principles, but then have a few things that are different as well. I was recently, actually just a couple of weeks ago, at a panel discussion in France about this very issue of, we dubbed the session the harmonization of global compliance programs.
Oh, harmonization.
Yeah, harmonization, which sounds much more pleasant, doesn't it, than battling it over which system works better. But yeah, it was harmonization because it was talking about, where do we see this all going? And I think what we're going to continue seeing is, what we've already begun seeing, which is a greater level of consistency, but also still differences, from one country to another and one region to another in terms of what it means to have a compliance program.
Yes, Gerry, one of the phenomena that I can mention like this is that you indicate 200 professionals being certified, in Brazil. And another phenomenon that we saw over the years that many professionals going abroad, they are certified in Brazil and, they get experience in local subsidiaries or local companies and they get invited. And also after COVID, right, there are a lot of global professionals, you can travel and you can work from anywhere. So we also see that happening. But one thing also is quite, I see more and more professionals wondering about, which is they're struggling to stay relevant in terms of their position, because during COVID, many companies struggle to survive. We still have some, recession coming up, this threatening recession. So I was wondering, what's your advice to professionals that are, going through these struggles and the daily dilemma of how they can make their job relevant and important for organizations?
Sure. That's a good question. And outside of what we've already mentioned, which is, the avoidance of problems and things of that nature, I do think that there are other things that compliance professionals can be doing. And I think probably at the top of the list, and this is not something that can be done overnight, but at the top of the list, there should be a goal of positioning the compliance unit, or at least the chief compliance officer, as one of the proactive business advisors within the organization. It's not simply telling the organization what it can and cannot do, and bringing the bad news. We've all heard that expression, the department of no, saying, no, you can't do this, no, you can't do that. And it's tough because sometimes, we use the expression, you're back on your heels, because you do have to say that sometimes. You do have to say, no, you just can't do it that way. But the goal should always be to be looking for the opportunities to contribute strategically to value of the organization by helping to design and develop programs for the organization alongside it that consider compliance as part of the strategy within the organization. And that, like I said, that is not something that happens overnight. But you need to find those couple of business unit partners that can recognize the value, and that you've said, hey, I'm actually here to help, and where I can be of greatest help is if I'm brought in early. Because if we're brought in early, we can consider these compliance ramifications as you design whatever it is that you're doing, a new plant, a new product, a new line of service, whatever that might be for the business. It's best to, and much more cost effective, to have these compliance considerations brought to the forefront right at the very beginning. It's much easier to design everything effectively from the beginning than it is to correct things later and say, no, you really shouldn't be doing it that way. Even if there aren't big violations, just making subsequent changes and subsequent corrections is much more costly than getting it right from the first, from the get-go. And related to that, kind of a second half of this is, I think one of the keys to being a good business advisor relates to developing and utilizing some of those softer skills. I'm not too wild about the term soft skills, but for lack of a better term, that's what I'll call them. That ability to collaborate and communicate and persuade and negotiate. I remember one of our former board members, in fact, even used the expression one time that he'd rather be called a chief persuasion officer than a chief compliance officer, because when he's doing his job best, he's convincing people if we do it the right way from the get-go, it benefits everybody. And so, you mentioned people coming from law, from internal audit. There's all sorts of backgrounds. There isn't one technical background that is a guarantee for success or failure. But one thing that is a guarantee for success or failure is not having these softer skills, because that is ultimately what is going to get the compliance unit that seat at the table, to be part of strategy setting, so that the compliance unit can be contributing at that level. And it takes a while to do that.
Yeah, one thing's for sure. I don't think it's good for anyone just sitting there and wondering and struggling, right? There is a community, there is association like ours, and their peers can always, support each other, and definitely anticipation, persuasion, believing something that really will count a lot for professionals. Well, let's go to the last question. Sorry, this is a podcast. I would love to stay here for, long hours chatting with you. But do you see any new risks coming on? And you mentioned about harmonization of compliance, but I think that one of the thing that the professionals always wonder as well is about, what are the new risks that we are not seeing, Yeah. I don't talk about that, ESG, and there are others coming up, the climate change. But is there anything else out there that you believe that it could be, the focus of compliance officers?
A couple things come to mind. First is, as you're alluding to, the scope of what falls under a compliance program is broadening rapidly. Mm-hmm. It might start out as anti-corruption, yes, and compliance's sole focus is anti-corruption, or we've seen in a couple countries it's antitrust or something like that. Once it's realized that this compliance program can be quite effective at managing one set of laws, why not apply it to others as well? So, like you said, ESG, privacy and data security, I think, are the two areas at the top of the list. We're starting to see more areas where tax-related compliance issues are working their way into compliance programs as well. Mm-hmm. And I think maybe the most complicated factor that we see is with multinationals. It's keeping up on compliance requirements when you're doing business in numerous different countries. It's funny because when I was recently in France, part of the discussion was why it seems like there's a lot of FCPA, enforcement actions against non-U.S. companies. And it's just like, well, a lot of this stems from the fact that when you're operating in multiple jurisdictions, you always have to comply with whatever the highest standard is, or whatever the standard is in that jurisdiction. And if the jurisdiction has a higher standard for one law, you need to comply with it. The comparison is, look at all the U.S. companies that are now getting penalized for violating GDPR in Europe, because the U.S. companies weren't prepared. They thought, well, what we're doing in the U.S. works just fine. Well, guess what? It doesn't work, in Europe. So you're getting these massive penalties, against U.S.-based companies because they haven't been complying with GDPR. That, I think, is those two are at the top of the list, but I think there are many, many other examples where something that works in one's home country doesn't, satisfy a requirement in another country. So balancing that and figuring that out, I think is an increasingly complex problem. And then one other consideration that comes to mind when we talk about issues, and this isn't really a compliance issue per se as much as a compliance program issue, and that is increasingly we're seeing enforcement agencies and government regulators increasingly emphasize the importance of data and data analytics as part of a compliance monitoring program. And a lot of compliance professionals do not come from a background where they're going to do the data analytics themselves, and that's fine. You don't have to be the data analyst to be a good compliance officer, but compliance professionals need to know enough about what can be done with data analytics and knowing what kind of data is available. Let's face it, the main thing that data analytics does for you is not necessarily find compliance violations as much as find the red flags of it. See, something's not looking right in this one area. Let's go drill down on it a little bit further. So I think, we have had a couple recent discussions outside the United States on this very issue, where compliance professionals are a little confused as to what they need to do regarding data analytics. They know it's important. They know that they don't have the technical skills to do it all themselves, but they need to know enough about it to be able to collaborate with the people who can do the data analytics. So those are a couple of the things that really jump to top of mind when you talk about some changes that the compliance professionals really need to be, prepared for.
Oh my God, I have so many things to talk about data, but we can do it in our next one. But
we can have a follow-up.
Yeah, we can have a follow-up on data issue, because it is actually. So any, final closing remark for us?
Well, mainly it's just congratulations. I can say this in all honesty, I've not seen any country that has made more progress as rapidly, as Brazil has. No country's ever out of the woods when it comes to corruption, and it'll happen again. We can guarantee we'll have more big cases, whether it's in Brazil or in other parts of the world. It just happens when you've got human behavior involved. There's going to be corruption, but organizations in Brazil are so much better prepared for it now, and we'll be able to deal with it so much better. When there is, not if, but when there is, acts of corruption or other compliance violations. So, Brazil is to celebrate this 10th anniversary of the legislation, I think is just a wonderful thing. There's much, much to celebrate. And the compliance community should just have a nice big party and enjoy itself and actively embrace these new challenges, because the challenges will continue and new challenges will come up, new areas. And that's actually a good thing. If new challenges weren't coming up, it means that we're not relevant. The fact that we're being presented with some of these new challenges proves partially that this is relevant. What we do is very relevant. What you do is incredibly important. All the compliance professionals in Brazil, the work that you do is so incredibly important to not just Brazil's economy and the people of Brazil, but globally. So keep it up. And let's have a 15-year anniversary party in 5 years, and then a 20-year anniversary party in 10 more years. And I will clear my calendar earlier to make sure that I can be there for the next ones. So thank you, Shin.
Yeah, thank you, Gerry. We will hold the next Basic Academy that's going to be on 28th August 2003 to 31st August 31st. So I hope that those who are listening and trying to seek for certification, this is the right one. It's going to be end of August. Gerry, thank you so much for your time, your kindness. As I said, SCCE HCCA is a very important organization in our field. And under your leadership and, the board members and everyone, the staff have been doing a great job. And we are very happy to be part of this, this partnership. So thank you again. I hope to see you in person in next celebration. This was Shin Jae Kim, head of compliance investigation practice group at TozziniFreire. And thank you again, and see you next time. Thank you for hearing us. Thank you. Bye, Gerry. Thank you.
Everyone. Bye-bye.